Hello everybody. Today's video is one I've looked forward to doing for a very long time. Today I'm going to show you the best settings to get the very best footage from the GoPro Hero 7 Black. I have used GoPros for many years, going way back to the GoPro Hero 4 Silver. I've also used the GoPro Hero 5 Black, the GoPro Hero 6 Black, and the brand new, latest and greatest GoPro Hero 7 Black. This camera is awesome. I purchased this camera about 9 months ago, and when I first got it, I adjusted some settings on it, and I took it for a test. I focused on what I liked about the footage, and I focused on what I didn't like about the footage. Then, I tweaked some more settings, and I got back out there again and did more tests. I did this over and over in several different environments and settings until I found the settings that gave me the ultimate best footage. In today's video, I'm going to show those to you step by step. Currently, this camera is configured with all of my best settings, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit reset and set them all back to the factory level. I am then going to go through every single setting step by step to show you what I have it set to, why it makes a difference, and then I'm going to show you some examples. So, let's hit that reset button. There it is. Factory reset. So one thing to note before we go further with this, make sure your GoPro is running on the latest firmware. If you would like to check out the best method for updating the firmware, the video is above. Once you've updated your firmware, get back here, click play, and I will show you all of the best settings. So let's get started. Now, some of the settings I'm going to show you today do assume that you want to do some video editing with them in post. However, if you do not want to video edit, there are a few settings I'm going to mention that will help you get good footage right out of this camera to share via social media, wherever you like to put your footage. So, this is going to be where we're going to set a lot of the important video options. The way we're going to do this is we're going to click down here where it says 1440, 60, and W. So when we click on this, first of all, we're going to see that the default resolution is 1440 with 60 frames per second. Let's click on that. So when we click to change that resolution, you're going to notice that it mentions the aspect ratio is 4:3. So as it says there, 4:3 is great for selfies and point of view shots, but I recommend the 16:9 ratio. This is going to be for the cinematic widescreen, and that's what we're going for. So you want to click on that, and then it's going to go to 16:9. Now on the left hand side, it's going to go to 1080p when you select that. We're going to select 4K. 4K is going to be the highest quality footage you can possibly get from this camera. Now, depending on what you're doing, you may not need to shoot in 4K. However, I recommend shooting in 4K as this helps future-proof your footage, and also, if you're going to be going back and editing, if you downscale 4K to 1080p, this can make some incredibly good looking footage. For our frame rate, we're going to select 60. Now, frame rate is something that really depends on what you're going to do. So it starts off at 60 here, but I recommend the final product always be 24. So if you're going to shoot in 4K 24, generally that's going to be video where there's going to be at least some talking in there. You want your frame rate to be 24 because when you're talking, you want the audio to match the video. If you do 60 or 30 for the frame rate, and then you interpret your footage as 24 later on, you can do some neat things with the footage by doing that, but you will not have audio that's usable because the audio will not match the speed of the video. I recommend 60 when you're filming video where you don't have talking in it, and where it's more focused on getting some faster moving action, or if you want to do some neat visual effects. Essentially, if you're shooting in 60, if you then downscale it to 24 frames per second in post, When you're editing, that's going to make the video about half speed. It's going to be slightly slower than half speed, technically. And that can look really neat, like if you want to focus on somebody walking or running, or maybe a car moving, a waterfall, anything like that, it can look really nice. It's going to slow it down and let the eye focus more on the actual movement versus it being really fast. So I definitely recommend that if you want to slow it down. Now 30 frames per second can be useful if you want to do the same thing, but if you don't want to slow it down that much. So you might ask, why is it that we want to have our eventual footage end up in 24 frames per second? 24 frames per second is the cinematic standard. Movies have been shot in 24 frames per second for many decades now. Not all movies. Some movies have experimented and gone to a different frame rate. However, generally viewers did not like this. Part of it's that our human brains have been trained to see 24 frames per second as the highest quality of footage. 24 frames per second affects how our brain sees the motion, and it tends to be more of that dreamy feel to the video. 24 frames per second simply seems to be the most appealing to most human beings. So like I said before, you can shoot in 60, 30, or 24 frames per second, and you can still have any of those end up at 24 as your finished product. However, if you're looking to shoot high quality video from the camera without having to do much or any editing at the end, then I recommend you stick with 24. So how do you get 60 frames per second or 30 frames per second to end up at 24? There's a method called interpreting footage. Most video editors, especially those like Premiere Pro or Final Cut, will have an option where you can tell the footage to be interpreted as 24. So for now, we are going to stick with 4K 60 frames per second. And you'll note that hypersmooth stabilization is set to on. You definitely want hypersmooth on. This technology has come a long way. In the GoPro Hero 7 Black, the stabilization is the best it's ever been in any GoPro. I find that even if I'm not carrying this with a stabilizer, that footage can be incredibly smooth. I find hypersmooth is best for vlogging purposes too. You know, you can have the camera held in front of you and it's going to be relatively still. Next setting here is field of view. Now, this field of view, you will have some different options depending on what frame rate and resolution you're in. But when you're in 4K at 60 frames per second, you do only have the option of wide. If we were to go back and change the resolution, let's go down to 1080p at 30 frames a second. If we do that and then went back here, it would offer us 3 different options now. Now the linear option is going to be the option that takes away any fisheye, so there won't be any of that rounding at the edge of the camera. Wide is the option we were already in, and then super view is going to be even wider angle than wide. So super view is going to be very wide and elongated. This can be good if you're taking in like particular landscapes where you want to kind of capture everything that's going on there. I generally recommend sticking with linear or wide. Next, you're going to see the low light setting, and by default it's set to auto. I'm actually going to turn this off. We do not want auto low light. Basically that will change the ISO and a few other settings, and that will tend to create very grainy footage. And grainy footage does not look good. Stabilization is set to auto. We want to keep that on. Pro Tune. Pro Tune is going to be very important. And this is where you're going to see the bulk of the specialized settings for getting incredible video from this camera. Pro Tune you definitely want set to on. And when we turn it on, you're going to notice a bunch of other options suddenly become available. So when I turn that on, shutter, EV comp, white balance, ISO min, ISO max, sharpness, color, raw audio, mics, and then the PT settings option all became available. So let's start with shutter. With shutter, you ideally want the shutter speed to be twice that of the frame rate. So right now we have 60 frames per second selected. So I change the shutter speed to 1/120th. If you wanted to change the frame rate back to 30, you would want to set the shutter speed to 1/60. And if you change the frame rate back to 24, then the shutter option of 1/50 would be what you would want to select. So the setting of EV comp, that is grayed out and not applicable. That setting is available if you set the shutter speed to auto, as I did there. This basically is going to help control your exposure. If you wanted to raise that to make it brighter, then you could do the half point there or higher. If you do have the shutter set, as I said, manually, you're not going to mess with that because it won't even be an option. But if you did have the auto shutter, you could set the exposure to underexpose or overexpose. Generally, that's going to be done for the purposes of editing later on, if you want to manually add back some light or take some away. However, you can still fix the exposure later on, even with the shutter speed selected. The next setting of white balance. Now with this, I recommend changing this. I don't recommend keeping it at auto. You'll find that it adjusts a lot and it can make your footage look vastly different, depending on how you have the camera pointed and what's going on in your scene. So I recommend manually setting this. I have found that if you are filming outside on a day that's got some sun and some clouds, even in somewhat lowish lighting, like if you're in the woods in the shade, I generally select 5500K. That one has worked best for me. As I will show you in some sample footage, the 5500K was selected as the white balance, and that tends to be quite accurate, but having it set to auto can make it much more difficult to fix because you don't have the same uniform white balance throughout the video as you will with a manual setting here. ISO minimum. So the lowest you can go with the ISO is 100. Definitely keep the 100 there. But ISO maximum, that starts off at 1600. I definitely do not recommend an ISO max of 1600. That will give the camera room to put that ISO up when it encounters lower lighting, and when it does that, it's going to introduce a lot of grain into the footage. So what I do is I set the ISO max all the way down to 200. So yes, 100 to 200 is not much range for the ISO. However, 100 to 200 and sometimes 400 is going to give you the best footage this camera can produce. There'll be very little grain to it, and it'll look really nice and sharp. If you get the ISO anywhere above 400, you're going to notice a lot of grain and noise in that footage, and grain and noise does not look good, especially on a GoPro. So basically, if you were shooting in such low lighting that you would need to put the ISO above 400, I would say you're not really using the GoPro for what it's best designed to do. The GoPro is best designed to be outside in natural lighting. It can be done on a cloudy day with ISO of 100 or 200 and still look great, but it's best done between sunrise and sunset. If you get past those times, that's when the ISO is not going to work. It'll make footage look super dark, and then if you try to raise it, it will introduce a lot of noise into that. So this next setting of sharpness, how you adjust sharpness is going to depend on if you want to edit the video later on, or if you're basically looking for one file coming out of this. If you're going to edit it, I definitely recommend putting the sharpness to low. Your video will look fairly smooth when you do that, but you can add sharpness later on when you're editing. However, if you shoot it in high or medium sharpness, you can't take that away. You're stuck with that. But if you do it in low sharpness, that footage is still capturing that detail. You're just bringing it out by changing the sharpness settings later on. For the color, this is also important. The default is GoPro for the color. Now GoPro, when you have that selected for the color, it's going to select your saturation, your contrast. It's basically going to do its best interpretation of what you would want as the finished product. So if you do not want to edit the final video, or if you want to do very minimal editing and you don't want to do color correction, keep it at GoPro. But if you want to make the very best footage later on and edit it and bring out all the colors you want to, and all the hues, the saturations, the contrast, the highlights, then you want to select flat. Flat is what I recommend. When you select that, the footage is going to look very dull, and there's not going to be a lot of contrast, color, or saturation there. But flat does capture all of that data. So later on when you are editing, you can bring all of that out and you can have a lot more freedom to customize the video with how you want it to look. So the raw audio setting, this determines the level of processing to create a raw audio track for your video. So basically, GoPro can do some internal processing in the camera with what it thinks is the best audio you can get. If you select low, that applies minimal processing. If you select medium, that's going to mess with the wind and or stereo based on the manual audio control setting. And then high applies full audio processing. That includes wind and or stereo and automatic gain. Now really this depends on what you want to do with the camera. If you are shooting it and you have someone talking, I recommend having that on high. Or if you want to capture any sound from the environment that you're shooting in, then it's a good idea to keep it on high. However, if you're not really caring about the audio you get from the video, then I recommend keeping it on low or off. In my case, I'm not generally talking to the GoPro, and if I am, I'll usually have an external mic, because this little camera, even though the mic on it is good, you're not going to get the kind of quality audio that you can get from an external mic. So I generally leave this off. But if I am talking to it and I don't have another mic, then I definitely opt for high. And then this next option that says mics, the default is auto. So when it's set to the default of auto, it sets it to automatically switch between wind and stereo for the best sound quality. Depending on where you're shooting and what the weather is like that day, if it is really windy, then you want to select the wind setting. If it's not too windy out, then I recommend selecting stereo. Stereo is going to give you the best sound from that, and as it says here, use that when wind is not a factor, and you want to ensure that your GoPro records in stereo. I recommend stereo in most cases, unless it is really windy out, so I'm going to set that to stereo. The auto I don't recommend, because that's going to result in the camera choosing for you. So if it detects some wind, it's going to switch to that, and then when the wind stops, it's going to switch back to stereo. And that can do very weird things, like the vocal tone can change and the volume of the voice can drop and increase. It does not create a good sounding audio. There you have it, folks. All the best settings are now configured on your GoPro Hero 7 Black. Now it's time to get out there and start shooting awesome footage. Once you've shot that awesome footage, I would love to see you link it here. If you have any additional questions or anything you want to talk about, make sure you leave it in the comments below, and I will get back to you. If you found this video helpful, please click like and subscribe.